Hi, welcome to the 67th presidential address of SSSP, the first virtual address. I am pre-recording this in my home in Chicago, which sits on the traditional territories of the Miami, the Oceti-Sakowin, the Potawatomi, and the Peoria. Thank you all for joining us today. This would have been the 68th presidential address, except that, to her credit, in 1964, Jessie Bernard refused to give a presidential address. She thought it was a boring and tedious ritual. She would have no part of it. I hope I am not boring or tedious today. Definitely not my goal. So let me begin with some thanks to folks that made this conference possible and pulled SSSP through a really rough year. First to Sadale Malaku and Barbara Katz-Rothman, the program directors, the committee chairs for this year. I would also like to thank Jake Simons, who did our beautiful graphic art for the program and the theme. Of course, Michelle Kuntz, Hector Delgado, and Rachel Cogburn. The three worked so much in terms of making this half-day virtual conference possible after having planned an entire in-person conference. And they just made my year as president doable, wonderful, and I thank you three so very much. I'd also like to thank the board. When COVID hit, when the pandemic hit, the board jumped in right away. We began meeting on a regular basis, and I think together we got a lot of really good work done. And I want to thank the board for being so on top of it, being so engaged in SSSP. Thank you. And I would also like to thank the Movement for Black Lives for bringing us hope, for building a foundation we so desperately needed and need at this time in history. As sociologists, we have a unique power. We can depress people in no time flat. It can be the most joyous occasion. We can see something that others seem to not be able to see. I know that over the past, well, forever, but since 2016 and then more recently, given the pandemic, a lot of sociologists have sort of sunk into despair. And I want to spend some time today talking about the issue of hope and how hope as a discipline, when brought together with a sociological imagination, can help us to dream transformation as we build new worlds. So that's where I would like to focus. I do think that we have in sociology what I would call a hope gap. And this gap exists between academic sociologists who are working in universities and people who are on the ground building movements, engaged in the work of building new worlds. I think there's a gap there, and I hope that we can speak to that and think about ways that we can weave hope into our discipline. I do think that hope is a glue that can bring together scholars and activists, and as I said, along with our sociological imaginations, help us to build new worlds. As we teach, as we mentor, as we move in the world, I want to ask us to think about how we use our sociological imagination. And as we work with students and we help them develop a sociological imagination, are we leaving them in a place where they can see social problems, but maybe don't have the understanding for a pathway and or haven't been given a sense of hope built into that imagination in order to move to better spaces. So some of the questions I think that we need to ask ourselves as sociologists in this moment, as members of the SSSP, they're the questions that are going to undergird my remarks today. Who are our people? Who's our community? Who do we see in the world? What histories do we call upon? And how do these connections that we have with others and our understandings and the ways that we see shape our dreams, our understandings of transformation? Throughout this talk, I'm going to be toggling back and forth between speaking of sociologists, scholar activists, mentors, educators. I had originally thought that I would really focus this talk on bringing hope into our pedagogy in the classroom. The world shifted a little bit, and so I've expanded. And in order to do that, I just want you all to be aware that I will be doing this toggling. A number of sociologists over time have begun their talks by noting that we were in a moment of crisis. I argue that maybe I have the corner on the crisis market, so I'm not going to do anything different there. We are in this moment of crisis. And so I want to take this moment, the pandemic clarifying, to talk about who we are as the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and then how we bring together this year's theme in reflecting on who we are and dreams of who we want to be as an organization. Founded in 1901 as a professional organization. And if the times were right for creating SSSP then, as Elizabeth Bryant Lee recalled, then what are the times demanding of us now? As a professional organization built in and through the discipline tied to the institution of higher education, an institution that's currently in a bit of a tailspin, then what should SSSP be doing now? And who do we want to be as an organization given what we're up against? So we are at this moment, this crossroads, so to speak. 50% of our membership has been traditionally graduate students, students that are looking for networks and mentors. And so if our purpose and our role was that we were working with younger scholars and we were, as we say everywhere, in pursuit of social justice, if those spaces aren't where graduate students will be moving anymore, then who are we? And what are we going to be moving toward? Currently, as of our last survey in SSSP, in response to the question of the importance of SSSP in people's lives, in our members' lives, the two top spots, one was folks wanted to engage in social justice research and action, and the other was that they wanted to come together in order to interact with a network of peers. In other words, what people are looking for is community and action that brings our unique disciplinary way of knowing the world together. So the question is, are we building towards this? If we look at what we've traditionally done, we host conferences, we give awards, we pass resolutions, we write letters, always with the question of who are we seeing in this process? And then as an organization, are we reacting in the world toward justice as our membership and as our organization hopes to be? So these are some of the pieces that we're looking at amid this crisis. So when we're asking about this process of seeing, who are we seeing, how are we seeing, this is happening amid a system of higher ed that has traditionally been quite hierarchical within the institution, and then within institutions, it's hierarchical, sorry. And recognizing that folks that are coming from faculty that are coming from teaching institutions versus the research ones, or as we have over here on the graphic, in the U.S. News and World Report. I'm sorry, I usually call it U.S. News and World Distort. So it took me a minute to remember to say it properly. So U.S. News and World Report and their rankings of higher education institutions. We know that on the other end of that ranking, that faculty that are in teaching institutions have access to fewer resources, their jobs are least protected, especially currently, and they have the least amount of time to engage in the sorts of accolade-getting work. That on the gravestone, could I have a course off for doing that? Writing of the important insights of W.E.B. Du Bois, Alden Morris has argued that within this system of higher education, American elite universities provide elite scholars the resources needed to support research infrastructures required to dominate the sociological landscape. Thus, in this process, bringing this back to the sociological imagination, we have this hierarchical structure in which those in elite institutions, given the resources, given the voice, have sway in the way that the sociological imagination is understood. The sociological imagination steeped in elite Western understandings of the world, a world in which elite people have an overwhelming stamp on what is seen and understood, and in which the elite are believed to have real agency. In that context, if the world is not arcing towards justice, then despair will dominate. And that is where the sociological imagination can be and has been steeped. The sense of despair is caused when the elite don't know what's happening on the ground. They don't live hope as a practice, don't understand the histories, the legacies, the communities that affirm hope for the long run, which I'm there horribly paraphrasing Angela Davis. And the pandemic is clarifying these inequalities, of course, and the precariousness of life for colleges and universities that are serving predominantly first-generation immigrant, working-class Black and Latinx students. For teaching colleges and universities struggling without endowments, and now state schools with rapidly evaporating funding, we are facing a real struggle in terms of workload for faculty and our ability to think through these issues and engage in these issues. In this moment, then, the inequality is exacerbating. So too will the dominance of the sociological imagination. If we take a look at higher education, 2 years prior to COVID, Adam Harris of The Atlantic wrote about its slow decline. So now we're going back to 2017, 2018. He cited, in the spring of 2013, there were 19 million and some odd and 100,000 students enrolled in higher ed. By the spring of 2017, we were down to 17,839,000. And this data comes from the National Center for Education Statistics. In 2017, 1/4 of private nonprofit universities and colleges ran on deficit. Historically, Black colleges and universities have been particularly vulnerable. This down here is the emblem of Wilberforce University, which was W.E.B. Du Bois's first university, the first place where he taught. They went into the pandemic with, I think it was a $27 million deficit. And they are currently facing somewhere in the range of a $30 million deficit. Universities are buckling under this. The critiques of a neoliberal system that created in large part these deficits, we've been critiquing it as sociologists for years. And it's caused all kinds of difficulties for faculty, for students, hardships in student loans and so on. We know how this all plays out. However, we also know that now that this pandemic has hit, they're projecting a 20% decrease in the number of students returning to higher ed in the fall. That's going to have enormous ramifications for our individual lives as well as for the SSSP. In a letter created by ASA and sent to Pelosi, McConnell, Schumer, and McCarthy, signed by more than 40 professional organizations, they included the following warning: without additional federal support for students and institutions, the seriousness of this crisis will necessitate additional layoffs of staff, faculty, elimination of programs and services for students, and significant tuition increases for students and families. Our origins, our growth, and sustainability have been directly tied to the professionalization of sociology in higher ed. So I just want to posit some questions. What do you all think? How will this context shape SSSP? Will SSSP exist as higher education declines? If so, what will it look like? Relatedly, will graduate students want or need a place like SSSP if higher ed is not an endpoint, a career endpoint? Should professional organizations think about merging? Should we become sections of ASA, sort of reverting the early discussions from the origins of SSSP? So let's take a step back to 1951 when SSSP was created. In 1951, we had what was considered the first transnational television broadcast. It was Harry Truman telling the country about the peace treaty that had just been signed with Japan. And that happened on September 4th. 2 days later, the SSSP was founded on September 6th in Chicago at Roosevelt College. That same year, the Rosenbergs, that same fall actually, the Rosenbergs had been sentenced to die. They were still alive at that point and in prison awaiting execution. The Red Scare and McCarthyism were being bolstered by some folks in the ASS, the American Sociological Society, and the Klan, with their overarching white supremacist terrorism, was in full effect. That year, Harry Moore, an early NAAC organizer, and his wife, Harrietta, were asleep in their home when it was blown up. We Charge Genocide organized a report that outlined the 152 killings of African Americans by police and lynch mobs between 1945 and 1951 that they were able to track in a report that they presented to the UN in order to raise awareness about the genocide happening against Black Americans in the United States. So this is a context that seems somewhat familiar. So if we now turn to the founding of this organization and go back into the early documents, on the right-hand side, we see the reminder for the first meeting, recognizing the organizing committee, 3 men, 3 white men, Ernest Burgess, Arnold Rose, Alfred McClung Lee. On the left is a letter dated May 31st, 1951, a few months prior to the meeting, the original founding meeting, and with discussions about how to approach this. They currently had 61 names on an invite list, and much like wedding planners, they were trying to get it down to 40. And point number 4, and I'm going to use my cursor here, point number 4, they state, or this is a letter from Arnold Rose to Al McClung Lee. So Arnold Rose states, for the initial list, and I hope not later on, we need primarily people of prestige. How was that prestige measured? Who was highlighted? Who was being seen in those initial lists? And by the way, I just want to point out that 2 of the men on the organizing committee had wives that had PhDs in sociology. The minutes of this first meeting, by the way, show that 4 of those in the organizing committee voted against SSSP as the name of this organization. And I would have also voted against it. So this is a slight digression. Here's what happens when I say, this year, oh, I'm president of SSSP. What is that? Oh, the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Oh, and now imagine this. I'm president of STOW. What is that? Oh, sociologists transforming our worlds. How do I join such an effort? Okay, that's my small advocacy for us to rethink the title of this organization, the name of this organization, as it was set in 1951. Back to what I was talking about here, the original meeting. So here we have the minutes of the original meeting. Elizabeth Betty Bryant Lee is not there. It's possible her name was left off the list, but the way that these minutes followed in the 50s was when there was a husband and wife duo, the man was listed and then the woman would be listed under the man. For instance, we can see down here, there's Arnold Rose and there's Carolyn Rose listed. Nowhere is Betty Bryant Lee. I do see Alfred McClung Lee right here where my cursor is, and Betty should have been right under him. She's not. So likely she was not in this founding meeting. Next, if we look at a letter from July 2nd sent to Dr. Alfred McClung Lee from Arnold Rose, we also see he's stating here our best to Mrs. Lee. Mrs. Lee had a PhD. Our best, he's talking about his wife, Carolyn Rose. They are 2 sociologists being spoken about and for, and not given proper cred in real time. I raise this because I have always heard from the start of this organization that it was founded by Betty Bryant Lee and Alfred McClung Lee. And in their book, the Gallaghers do a really wonderful job of bringing Betty's voice forward. And it is clear from these historical documents that, in fact, it didn't play out exactly in that way. This is really an important sort of moment to recognize Cite Black women. Because what happens when people are not seen and not recognized, they can be written out of history and/or history rewrites them. Cite Black Women is a collaborative that is saying, or a collective that is saying directly, recognize and see. We will write our histories. So I did this quick Google search where I included the name, sociology, and bio to see what happens historically. Where is the memory? And now this is an online memory, but where is the memory when people aren't really seen? So here's what happened when I put in Elizabeth Bryant Lee, sociology, bio. This is what came back. Elizabeth Bryant Lee and Alfred McClung Lee. It's from 2011. It begins with Alfred, then says Elizabeth, and then talks about both. Next, I put in Alfred McClungley. What comes up is Alfred's bio, and it comes up in a special blow-up box as Google returns. Here's like your best thing, and then it sends you to Wikipedia. Under spouse, it's Elizabeth Bryant Lee, but there isn't that both. He's a standalone. Okay, did the same thing for Carolyn Rose, and here's what came up. Put in Carolyn Rose, and Arnold Rose comes up. So then we learn that Arnold Marshall Rose, ... lots of text, but still so that we can see that Carolyn's name is in the article, and his wife, a sociology who collaborated with him. Now, we put in Arnold Rose, and here it is. He gets his blow-up box, his picture. It brings us to ASA and more details about his life. And based on the information they give us, one would not even know he had been married. It didn't matter. It's his professional life. So really nothing new here, but a clarity. The importance of a collaborative such as Cite Black Women. We can learn so much from seeing a one-slide digression here on historylessness and amnesia. We need to be clearer about the history that we call upon and imagine. This is what Mary Romero was trying to help us to understand through her presidential address in ASA last year, and Claire Renzetti a few years earlier in SSSP. Nostalgia cleanses history of the aspects we don't want to remember. And we have to be conscious of who's been cleansed and why. Nostalgia tales then fill historical voids in particular ways for particular purposes. Elite groups or colonizers use amnesia and historylessness to prop up what it is they want propped up. Nostalgia provides an emotional cover for what Charles Mills and Melissa Stein and others have referred to as strategic ignorance. The root of the word is ignore, means to choose not to see. If particular histories are strategically ignored because elite histories are told as legitimate histories, then entire realities of oppressed people are disregarded. When we know our histories, we're able to locate ourselves. And this has to be the beginning of our dreams of transformation. Stuart Hall argued we have to locate ourselves somewhere in order to speak on the world. And I would add that as we speak on the world, that we do that as active, engaged, liberatory human beings. Examples abound of folks that claimed histories and spoke in the world as active, liberatory human beings. One wonderful example we have in history is Ella Baker. Ella Baker was frustrated often by the leadership of the civil rights movement. She was working closely with young organizers to build the foundations, to build based on dreams of transformation. She was working with young organizers, young folks, teaching them about leadership, their own, helping them to develop their sense of agency and power in the world, understanding how to develop community and organizations. And sometimes civil rights leaders would walk in for the media moment. And or once the young people had done the work of building, they might move in and take on for their own ends what had been built. Reading the life of Ella Baker, we learn about how to organize, to dream, to empower, to build. We have to begin by developing the voices of those doing the work, learning from those doing the work. Dreaming transformation cannot happen without the hope, without our understanding of where we're situated and a belief in community in others. So Ella Baker mentored young people. What if our sociological imagination was used in concert with dreams of transformation to build pathways so that, like Ella Baker, it meant that when moments were right, things could grow. The foundation would be laid. If we look at the past 5 years, 6, 7 years in the US and the organizing on the ground, disproportionate organizing among Black youth. So what do you all think? Who are we as sociologists? How do we think about ourselves at this point? On the despair side, do we believe that our dreams are too micro, too uncomplex in a really complicated world? Have we put ourselves in the role of standing on the side, declaring ourselves the lamenter of the horrors of the world, and then plucking an individual here and there, just enough individuals to avoid complete despair? Do we stop ourselves from dreaming transformation for fear of greater despair? Rebecca Solnit reminds us, if we can stand on despair as solid ground, we can stand on hope as solid ground. What if our dreams of transformation took seriously the power that we have? How would it change our lives? Change our relationships with colleagues or comrades? Change our relationship to SSSP? How might our dialogue change from lamenting in despair to imagining new worlds? And this one, I think, as a group of people became apparent in the last few months, how do we help people find their lane? How do we find our own lane? If you all are like me, you have just been inundated with emails from former students and others, folks that see you doing media appearances or whatever it is, asking, what can I do? How can I be involved? This is just wrong. So we do have an obligation, because we can see, how to help people find their lanes. And then how do we engage in dialogue about the future? These are some of the questions that we should be discussing with one another. In 1997, Pamela Roby, past president of SSSP, pulled together a collection of essays by division chairs in SSSP. She asked them to respond to 4 questions. What are your visions for the world? What arenas are you working toward to achieve your vision? What are your goals as a scholar activist? And what challenges are you facing? And I would add now a 5th question from Ella Baker. Who are your people? Who do you claim as your people? That means, who do you trust? Whose stories do you listen to and believe? Who do you dream with? Who do you build with? Who do you feel responsible to? These posters have been popping up all over Chicago. I don't know if you're seeing them in your communities. But in a world driven through a neoliberal frame, the question of who your people are and community is wiped because things come down to the individual. It's why I love these posters so much. Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, you're resilient, that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient. It's a recognition that we need to change the larger structures, that acting alone is like committing suicide. We need, quoting Frary there, we need to be working in community, seeing ourselves in one another, not just taking on more punishment from the system. So let's talk about what it looks like through the lens of a mentor. A sociologist mentoring either as a professor in a professional organization like SSSP, teaching in the classroom, whomever it is that we are mentoring. What do you think? How much of our social location, our awareness of power, dreams of transformation are conscious? in our mentoring? Are we reaching and creating communities that see across boundaries, not just see within limited spaces? How are we using the power we have to lift? What does professional mentoring look like now? And if we're mentoring new scholars into academia, our job is pretty straightforward. We teach them what we did, what worked, what didn't work, beware of this. But if we're the last generation of tenure track professors or tenured professors, what are we mentoring young people, young PhDs and others toward? One of the things that we must do following the steps of Ella Baker is we have to bring young people, bring our mentees to a place where they can find their people, their communities. We cannot leave them with a sociological imagination, able to see the horrors of the world without a way to build pathways forward. That has to be a central piece of the mentoring we engage in. And in the end, when I speak of hope, this is what I'm talking about. Hope is not something that we can hand to our students in a bottle. Rather, it's a way of knowing, a practice, a way of being that brings us into connection with other human beings as we build, support one another in community, engage in dialogue while moving towards the building of better worlds. It's the knowledge that we matter, that we have agency. And when we connect with others and mobilize towards just worlds, even if we're not going to get there in our lifetime, it keeps us connected to the work that must be done. Our hope can be expressed in words or action, as Ella Baker taught us. So when we take all of this, and now we come back to SSSP, and we look at who we are in this context, in this moment where we've been, I just want to leave with some further questions. We have spaces where we could come together in dialogue, not just once a year in a conference, but across the year. We're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point. We could set up regular discussions, dialogues, talk through these ideas. Through SSSP, we have so many resources. The agenda for social justice, the global agenda for social justice, we have all of these divisions and folks that are thinking of ideas in these different spaces. What if we started doing weekly chats, weekly dialogues, coming together? What if we started bringing together sociologists and activists and building that piece out? There's so many things that we can do. Once we figure out who we are, what it is we see moving forward, if keeping the space of SSSP is what we want so that we can come together once a year, we need to recognize that, and then we need to recognize the work that must be done and goes into creating such a space. Just by way of information, to even have a conference, an in-person conference, those contracts are signed 4 years in advance. Michelle has kept this organization running so efficiently, so well, that we know we can count on, outside of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but even now this virtual, we can count on coming together. If that's important to us, we need to protect that. And we need to think about who we are and what the coming together means and looks like. I'm proposing that we focus much more on coming together in dialogue across time, throughout the year, thinking through efforts that are underway, figuring out what our lane is, how we should be talking with others about finding their lane. I agree so strongly with Paulo Freire when he says, dialogue is a moment when humans meet to reflect on their reality as they make and remake it. Dialogue is a challenge to existing domination. Thank you all. This is a question for, thank you all, by the way, we're live again and I wore the same shirt that was recorded in July, early July. But I just want to ask Rachel a question. Rachel, should I read the Q&A questions? Oh, okay. Could people raise their hands and then Rachel is going to bring you in so you can speak whatever you want to say. So if you raise your hand, she'll see it and be able to bring you in. So if you all, the way that this platform is set up, Rachel can turn your volume on. So if you have questions, then you just have to, I guess you do the hand raising thing, which I don't know where it is, but it's probably one of the icons at the bottom. Or maybe you can just put a note in the chat so Rachel knows to make you, to give you volume.
I guess I'm the first person. Hi, Heather.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I like the beard. Wow.
Oh yeah, it just does that. I don't know. Yeah, grooming goes out the window when you have lots of things.
I hear you.
Well, first, that was a great talk. I was just overwhelmed by the number of things and issues that you connected that I think about separately, but that you kind of created a very nice narrative for. And then, so I was kind of processing that. And then after I finished,
It's 11 hours.
oh, sorry about that. After I finished, sort of got over that or being overwhelmed, I went back to one of your early questions, which is, what should SSSP do? And you said, should we merge with other associations? And then at the end, you said, should we talk every week? I think these are big ideas, and I think the times do call for big ideas. I'm not sure. I think that whatever happens, I think that one thing that is important about SSSP, or has been for me, is that it's a place where people can talk about how to make things better, and we don't have to agree, but we all kind of understand that we're on the same page. And ASA, you can find that there too, but the goal is different. It's more about understanding the world, which is also important. So whatever happens, I think that finding like that creative tension where disagreement, but also being on the same page, that has to be maintained somehow. And whether it's through dialogues or whatever it is, I don't know. So yeah, I guess my question is, what do you think about how do we maintain this like creative tension where we want to disagree, we want to have diversity of opinions in order to reach the right, solutions?
So I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question directly, but my experience, and it just may be my personality, but I'm guessing not. My experience is you put three sociologists in a room and we're going to be depressed in 30 seconds because our conversations move in that way. And so I guess it's sort of this call for being conscious of, as we're having these dialogues, and no, absolutely, we should be coming from all of these different places and critically challenging one another based on our experiences and locations and all of that. But always aware that we have to have some dream of transformation that we're moving toward, or we just keep devolving into this defensive posture that's despair producing. Yeah. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but I do think we have to, it's those dreams of transformation and where we hold the sense of hope that we can move in these directions. So it helps us use our sociological imagination, not to always find the horrors, because we're good at that. It's so easy, but to then use that imagination to start dreaming these new worlds and moving toward them. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I see Wendy's up.
I wish we could have a drink.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I miss everyone so much. I want to say that. And I want to thank you so much, Heather. You did a beautiful job. Even without these circumstances, like for video and audioing yourself, it would have been awesome. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your historical research into SSSP, because that was one of the most fascinating parts to me, the wives and the origin story.
Yeah, so there's an archive that's held at Brooklyn College, and I was particularly interested in the origins of SSSP because its first meeting was held in the university where I've been a professor since 1996, and we're Roosevelt University now. We were Roosevelt College then. And it was actually with the help of Michelle that she put me in touch with the folks at Brooklyn College. So any one of us they will send the records to us. It was just fascinating. I wasn't expecting to find the absence of Elizabeth Bryant Lee. That was surprising, but I have nothing beyond that. I don't know.
You don't want to talk about your other historical research that you've been doing at all?
Marie Antoinette?
Yeah.
Oh, I would love to, but I think we only have 15 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I start on that and I won't stop.
Okay.
We can do that over drinks. We can have, yeah, I'll meet you all at a reception afterwards. And
thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Am I up? Can you hear me, Heather?
Yeah, I can hear you, Hector.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but I was asked to write the afterword, right, for an agenda for social justice, special issue on COVID. And I touched on a familiar theme, and Corey actually makes reference to it as well. This is probably a good time to sort of examine where we are and where we want to go. One of the things I mentioned in the piece that I wrote is when I was doing research on the unionization of undocumented workers, I asked one of the organizers how academics could get involved, and he sort of smiled, right? And he said, well, you know, you have like research skills that we can use. He goes, but, you know, you guys, you form a committee, then you form a subcommittee, then you form a subcommittee to the subcommittee. And basically he says, you know, you guys love to talk. You spend a lot of time talking. We don't have that luxury, right? So I guess the question is, the dialogue, I think, is a great idea. I think we have to stay in touch with each other for a lot of reasons, and not just for the reasons you stated. But how do you translate, and can an organization like this, Corey sort of posed a similar question too, right? What I think is a false dichotomy, but it gets posed all the time. Can you be an activist organization and still maintain certain professional standards, right? Again, that's not really an issue for me, but the fundamental question though is, how do you just dialogue forever until you can't talk anymore, or how do you translate that into action?
So I think that our action is absolutely guided by how we think about the world. And so if our dialogue is continuously bringing us to a place of despair, probably there's not going to be a whole lot of action, right? We act when we feel a sense of hope and we have those dreams. So I don't think that dialogue ever stops. Perhaps it's that very much, you know, the theory and practice piece that we have to be engaged in our action. I mean, my experiences when I'm involved in community-based actions, it's really hopeful. I see how change is happening. And then that hope can come back and inform other sorts of dialogue. I do want to say one other about the first half of your question. At Roosevelt, we sent a group of students into the community to ask community organizations what they needed while working with universities. And one of the things that they told us is what they don't need. And what they don't want are universities coming in and then writing for grants for the money that they need. So what they need is for us to come in with our research skills and our writing skills, but in order to use that money on behalf of those organizations. So it's just one of those seams that we could be really mindful of.
Yeah, the organizer I talked to had that in mind. In other words, we'll tell you what we need research on.
Yeah, and I want to apologize to Glenn and all the contributors to the most recent the social justice agenda stuff. Because this video was put together basically at the end of June, the slides, I didn't have access to the most recent agendas for social justice and all, so yeah. I don't know if I'm supposed to be looking somewhere for questions. So Rachel, I'm looking at your box for guidance.
If you'll click at the Q&A button at the bottom
Yeah.
of your screen and scroll all the way down to the last question.
Okay.
And it just came in at 2:06.
Oh, so Joaquim is asking a question about, you highlight our agency, but challenge the notion of resilience. How can we act as scholars against structural forces within our institutions? Can we be resilient as individual scholars, organizationally as an independent SSSP, or as a section of ASA? So I guess what I'm responding to relative to the resilience is the idea that we just have to be tougher. And, you know, there's lots of words that are used for it. Grit, resilience, I guess, are the first two that come to mind. And somehow if we just can put up with more abuse from the system, basically, we'll be able to make it. But the fact is that working as individuals, individual units, there's really not much to make. You know, there is the Horatio Alger stories, there's all of those heroic stories that have guided the US into these and through these notions of radical individualism. But if we are going to be able to create change in the world, if we are going to be able to sustain hope and build, that happens in the context of community. And, you know, it's in community that we're affirmed and we can find our strength and actual resilience rather than as the individual out there trying to just survive. So I'm not sure, Joaquim, if that answers the question or if you want to clarify that question further, but that's my take on resilience. I remember many years ago when my daughter was young and I was learning how to do her hair, to do cornrows and whatever, I read a book called Tender-Headed, and it was the same sort of idea that to call somebody tender-headed was an indication that they were weak, that they just needed to be able to put up with more pain. And I see this all along similar lines, the use of resilience. Talk about an interesting format for dialogue. The question I want to ask right now is, if the tree falls, there's no way to see or know the sorts of feedback, which I guess will be good practice for all of us for this fall.
Heather, Joaquin has a follow-up question for you.
Oh, do I need to pull that up somewhere? Oh, okay. How do we distinguish agency from resilience? Yeah, I guess, you know, we can break that down into the layers of psychology. I can define for you how I'm distinguishing it. That resilience is a term that is grounded in neoliberal ideologies, and that is that we can compete. The market is the space where the competition happens, and if we can just suck it up and have grit and get in there and fight it out, then we will succeed. And it's like the success is defined by this market and it happens on an individual basis. Whereas agency is understanding this larger context and understanding the injustice of that context, understanding where we're located, ways that we are advantaged and disadvantaged, and what all of that means. The narratives in the world that we believe and why, and who told us those narratives, and how that defines who we identify with and who we trust. Real agency comes from those spaces of knowing who we are and then through connection with others. So that's how I'm using agency and resilience a little bit differently, or defining those two terms.
Heather, we have 2 minutes left, and I believe there are some people here that have some questions.
Oh, great. Can they unmute themselves and ask? Or
Yes, that's all they have to do is unmute.
okay.
Okay, I was just gonna ask a second question to have, since we have you here. I advise master's students, and so some of them apply to PhD programs, and so I took to heart what you were saying about the collapse of our profession and what that means for people who want to enter it. How do you handle that? And what are some ideas that I could glean from your experience with that?
Yeah, I don't handle it very well. I used to really encourage, because I'm in a university with a lot of first-gen students and immigrants, and I used to encourage a lot moving forward in higher ed. And now I have the very frank discussion and talk about really what their goals are in life and what sorts of change they want to make in the world, and then sorting through those pathways. I'm not as quick to help students think about moving in further into higher ed. The short answer.
Hi, Heather. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
My connection is really shaky. Hi. I have a question, and I guess it's perhaps part critique, but it's not meant that way. But I'm thinking, generally speaking, I very often, because I'm a psychologist and a sociologist, I very often I believe that even though hope is a positive thing, sometimes kind of a crash and burn leads to so much better. And sometimes a certain amount of anger and disillusionment and hopelessness can actually kind of bring you that fire you need for change. And I think that in these times when we're seeing the things that are happening, both on a social movement level, on a health level, and many other things, in some ways, hopelessness and being tired of the situation as it is might actually be kind of what we need to, just scrap the whole thing and start again. And I'm wondering what you think about that. And because I'm all for hope, and usually I would be the hopeful one in the room, but I feel like maybe I'm playing devil's advocate, because it is a part of, I think that you always need that balance, right? You need that one person in the room that isn't just all like, hey, it's all going to be great. Or you need that one depressed person to remind everyone that, depression is a thing. And being disillusioned is what a lot of people do feel. So of course, it's not good if we're kind of compounding that through our own little circles, but perhaps sometimes seeing the world and the terrible place that it is for a lot of people might actually fuel the activism that we need.
Point well taken. It's 1:16, so I'm going to answer this question, and then we need to move. So here's the deal. With the sociological imagination, I think our students, once they have that tool, they can see the horrors in the world. And anger, absolutely, it's important, right? It's an important emotion and can motivate us. But anger that sits with an individual, it can also lead to depression, right? So it's when that anger meets community and dreams of new worlds, anger and hope don't sit in opposition to one another. Nor do I think that hope and optimism are the same thing. You know, I'm not using hope in that sort of self-help, here's the bottle, drink it, and we're going to feel good. Not at all. I see that the hope is, we're in community and we're connected now, and I can see your humanity, and our humanity isn't tied by some despair that we're all going to end up dead tomorrow, but rather our humanity is tied in this vision that we've got work to do and we're committed to it. To me, that's what hope is. So thank you for your question.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that it's up to me to adjourn this, my own address. So I move to adjourn. I thank you all for hanging in there and listening to this. Michelle, anything else that has to happen?
No, it's time to move on to the awards recognition that will begin shortly.
Okay, we'll see you all back at the awards recognition. Please join us. We've got some really wonderful folks receiving awards.